Jamal Carter stood in a Birmingham courtroom, wrists cuffed, facing a petty trespassing charge, when Judge Vivian Blackwell sneered, "You're nothing but a thug wasting my time." The crowd gasped at her venom. 10 minutes later, Jamal snapped. Handcuffs on her wrists, her face drained of color, terror in her eyes. Whispers buzzed. How did this thug flip the script? This fleeting triumph would unravel a nightmare, scarring Jamal's future with secrets too dark to bury. What price would he pay for daring to fight back? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice against corruption, hit like and subscribe because tomorrow's explosive episode is one you can't miss. Jamal Carter stood rigid in the Birmingham courtroom, the air thick with humidity on that sweltering July morning. His wrists chafed from the cold steel cuffs biting into his skin. At 45, he carried the lean frame of a man who'd spent years dodging bullets and shadows, his sharp brown eyes scanning the room, catching every flicker of movement. His white button-up shirt clung to his back, pressed crisp despite the heat, and his short black hair gleamed under the fluorescent. Lights trimmed neat as always. He faced a minor trespassing charge, a flimsy accusation tied to a night he'd been snapping photos near an old warehouse down by the river for a client who'd begged for discretion. The docket said he'd crossed a line, but Jamal knew the truth. He'd been too close to something rotten, something that stank of power and prejudice. Before him, high on her polished oak bench, sat Judge Vivian Blackwell, 60 years old, her silver hair pulled tight into a bun, her thin lips twisted into a permanent scowl. She was a fixture in Birmingham, known for her iron rulings and a reputation whispered in black neighborhoods as a woman who saw skin color before she saw law. Today, her pale blue eyes bore down on him like he was dirt tracked onto her pristine floor. The courtroom buzzed with a sparse crowd, maybe 20 souls scattered across the worn wooden pews, their murmurs a low hum against the creak of ceiling fans spinning lazily overhead. A young black woman in the back row, Aisha Monroe, scribbled notes on a pad, her braids swaying as she worked. A reporter for a local paper with a nose for buried stories. Up front, the prosecutor, a wiry white kid named Ethan Price, barely 30, shuffled papers, his tie crooked and his voice nasal as he read the charge aloud. "Your Honor, Jamal Carter is accused of trespassing on private property near the Old Carver warehouse on July 15th, violating City Ordinance 12-4. His words hung there, thin and brittle, like a thread waiting to snap. Jamal kept his hands clasped tight in front of his chest, fingers laced, his breathing slow despite the weight pressing on his ribs. He'd been here before, not in this exact room, but in this exact trap, where the system flexed its muscles to remind him who held the reins. Vivian Blackwell leaned forward, her bony fingers tapping the bench, her gaze slicing through him. "People like you don't belong here," she said, her voice a hiss that cut the air, dripping with contempt so raw it made the crowd shift uncomfortably in their seats. A white man in a faded polo coughed into his fist, and an older black woman clutched her purse tighter, her lips pursed. Aisha's pen froze mid-stroke, her eyes narrowing as she caught the judge's tone. Jamal didn't flinch, didn't blink, his face a mask of calm carved from years of swallowing worse. He'd grown up in Birmingham's West Side, where the streets taught you to stand tall when the world wanted you flat. 20 years as an undercover cop had hardened him further, chasing dealers and killers through alleys and backrooms, wearing masks of his own to survive. He'd left the force 5 years back, traded the badge for a PI license, but the instincts never faded. He knew Vivian's type, knew the game she played, and he'd come prepared. "Your Honor," he said, his voice low and even, cutting through the stifling heat. "May I speak?" She snorted, a sharp bark of a laugh that echoed off the walls, her lips curling into a sneer. "Speak? What's a man like you got to say that's worth hearing?" The crowd murmured again, a ripple of unease spreading like spilled water. Aisha scribbled faster, her jaw tight. Ethan Price shifted on his feet, glancing at Vivian, then back at his notes, unsure where this was headed. Jamal held her stare, his pulse steady, refusing to let her barbs sink in. "I'd like to address the charge," he said, each word deliberate, a stone dropped into still water. Vivian slammed her gavel down, the crack splitting the room, her scowl deepening into something feral. "You don't address anything here, boy. I've seen enough of your kind to know what you are. 30 days in county, no trial needed case. Closed." The bang of wood on wood rang out, final as a gunshot, and the air grew heavier, pressing down on everyone like a wet blanket. The older woman in the crowd sucked her teeth, shaking her head, while the man in the polo smirked, folding his arms. Aisha's pen scratched furiously, her eyes darting between Jamal and the judge, catching every second of the injustice unfolding. Ethan Price opened his mouth, then shut it, his job done, his conscience apparently unbothered. Jamal's gut twisted. Not from fear, but from the weight of what he knew, what he'd carried into this room like a loaded clip. Vivian's racism wasn't new to him, wasn't even a surprise. He'd heard the stories, the whispers in barbershops and church basements about her rulings, how she'd lock up black men for breathing wrong while letting white dealers walk with a wink. But this wasn't about her bias showing its teeth today. This was about the rot he'd been digging into for months, the dirt under her robes he'd tracked down with every late night and every risked favor. His client, a jittery warehouse worker named Malik Dyson, had hired him to sniff out something shady, something tied to that crumbling building by the river. Jamal had found it all right, found more than Malik ever dreamed, and it led straight to Vivian Blackwell. He'd spent weeks piecing it together, tailing shadows, recording hushed talks, building a file that could topple her throne. The trespassing charge, a flimsy excuse, a setup to shut him up, but they'd miscalculated. Jamal wasn't some scared kid they could slap down. He was a man who'd walked through fire and come out holding the match. His eyes flicked to Aisha, catching her gaze for a split second, a silent signal she didn't yet understand. She tilted her head, curious, her instincts kicking in. The crowd settled, waiting for the bailiff to haul him off. But Jamal stood, rooted, his mind racing, his plan clicking into place. Vivian leaned back, satisfied, her thin fingers brushing a stray hair from her forehead, her smirk saying she'd won before the fight even started. She didn't know it yet, but she'd just lit the fuse on her own downfall. Jamal's lips twitched, not a smile but a shadow of one, as he felt the weight of the evidence in his pocket, the USB drive burning against his thigh. He'd come here to face her, sure, but not as a defendant. He'd come to bury her. The courtroom clock ticked, each second a hammer on an anvil, and Jamal's chest tightened with the certainty of what was coming. He'd played this game before, knew the rules, knew the cost. Vivian thought she'd caged him, thought her word was law, but she'd underestimated the man she'd just called a thug. He'd spent 20 years breaking men tougher than her, men who bled red and paid in cash, and now he'd break her too. The air buzzed with tension, the crowd's whispers fading into a hum, all eyes on him as he stood there, silent, waiting for the moment to strike. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to beg. He had the truth, and it was sharper than any gavel she could swing. The next 10 minutes would flip this room upside down, and Jamal was ready to watch it burn. Jamal Carter stood in the Birmingham courtroom, the humid air clinging to his skin like a second shirt, his wrists still raw from the cuffs that had bound him moments ago. The clock above Judge Vivian Blackwell's bench ticked past 9:45, each second a drumbeat in his chest as he watched her smirk fade into a flicker of unease. Her sentencing still echoed, 30 days slapped down like a guillotine, her voice a venomous whip. Case closed. The crowd of 20-odd spectators had settled into a restless hush, their eyes darting between the wiry black man in the dock and the silver-haired judge perched above, her pale blue stare now narrowing as Jamal cleared his throat. "I've got evidence you're dirty, Your Honor," he said, his tone steady as steel, cutting through the stifling heat like a blade through cloth. The room jolted alive, a gasp rippling from the back where Aisha Monroe, the young reporter, snapped her head up, her pen hovering over her notepad. Vivian's gavel crashed down, wood splintering the silence, her lips twisting into a snarl. "What nonsense is this? You dare speak out of turn?" Jamal didn't flinch, his sharp brown eyes locking onto hers, unflinching against the venom she'd spewed minutes ago, calling him a thug, a nothing. He'd swallowed worse insults in 20 years undercover, crouched in Birmingham's underbelly, busting gangs while wearing their colors, Now a PI, he'd traded the badge for a quieter fight, but this was no quiet moment. "I'm not just a defendant," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry. "I'm a private investigator, been one for 5 years, and I've been watching you." The crowd buzzed. A white woman in a floral dress clutching her pearls, an older black man in a faded cap leaning forward, his brow furrowed. Aisha's braids swayed as she scribbled, her breath catching at the shift in the air. Vivian laughed, a harsh, booming sound that bounced off the peeling walls, her thin fingers, gripping the gavel like a lifeline. "Watching me? You're delusional, Carter. Sit down before I add contempt to your sentence." But Jamal was done sitting. He reached into his pocket, slow and deliberate, pulling out his phone, its scratched screen glinting under the lights. "This ain't delusion," he said, tapping the device. "It's proof." He pressed play and a grainy audio crackled to life, Vivian's voice spilling out sharp and unmistakable. "I need 20,000 by Friday, Vipers. Make it quick, or your boys start talking." A man's growl followed. "You'll get it, Judge, but keep the heat off us." The courtroom erupted, shouts and gasps colliding like thunder. The older man in the cap muttered, "Lord have mercy," while the woman in floral gripped her seat, her face paling. Aisha's eyes widened, her pen flying across the page. Vivian slammed her gavel again, 3 quick bangs, her face flushing red. "That's fake, a cheap trick, turn it off." Her voice cracked, betraying the panic clawing up her throat. Jamal pocketed the phone, his lips twitching into a grim line. "It's real, Your Honor. Recorded 2 weeks ago outside the Iron Vipers clubhouse on 5th Avenue. I've got dates, times, witnesses. You've been taking cash from them for years, burying their cases." The room spun into chaos, a spectator yelling, "She's crooked," while another hissed, "Quiet down." Ethan Price, the prosecutor, stood frozen, his papers trembling in his hands, his mouth opening, then shutting like a fish out of water. Vivian's sneer faltered, her bony frame stiffening as Jamal took a step forward. "I'm not here to play," he said, his voice dropping low. "I'm here to end you." She pointed the gavel at him, shaking. "You'll pay for this slander, Carter. I'll have you locked up for life." But Jamal wasn't done. He turned to the court clerk, a balding white man with sweat beading on his forehead, and nodded. "Call the federal agents, they're outside." The clerk hesitated, glancing at Vivian, but her glare faltered under the weight of the room's stares. He picked up the phone, mumbling into it, and seconds later the double doors at the back burst open, wood banging against plaster. 2 federal agents stormed in, boots thudding on the scuffed floor, their navy jackets emblazoned with bold yellow letters, FBI. The taller one, Agent Darnell Brooks, a black man with a buzz cut and a jaw like granite, flashed his badge, his deep voice booming. "Vivian Blackwell, step down, we've got a warrant." The shorter agent, a white woman named Claire Hensley, her blonde ponytail swinging, held up a folder thick with papers, her green eyes cold. "Bribery, obstruction, conspiracy. You're done." The crowd roared, a mix of cheers and stunned curses, the older man clapping slow and loud, Aisha leaping to her feet, her notepad forgotten. Vivian sprang from her chair, her robes flapping, her face a mask of fury. "This is outrageous. You can't touch me. I'm the law here." But Jamal was already moving, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his back pocket, the metal glinting as he crossed the floor in 3 strides. He grabbed her wrist, her skin clammy, under his grip, and snapped the cuffs on, first one then the other, the click echoing like a gunshot. Her eyes went wide, wild with terror, her breath hitching as she shrieked, "You'll rot for this, Carter, you hear me? Rot!" He leaned in close, his voice a whisper only she could hear. "Not today, Judge." The crowd surged to their feet, applause crashing like waves, the woman in floral gaping, the older man pumping a fist. Aisha snapped photos with her phone, her hands shaking with adrenaline. Agent Brooks stepped up, nodding at Jamal. "Good work, Carter. We've been chasing her trail for months. That audio's gold." Claire Hensley grabbed Vivian's arm, pulling her toward the door, but not before Vivian twisted back, her silver hair wild, spitting words like venom. "This isn't over, you filthy thug. You think you've won? I'll bury you." Jamal stood tall, his white shirt wrinkled now, his sharp eyes tracking her as the agents hauled her out, her screams fading down the hall. The room buzzed with disbelief. Spectators crowding the aisles, a few shouting, "On justice!" while others whispered, "What just happened?" Ethan Price slumped into his chair, his face pale, his career teetering on the edge of this mess. Aisha darted toward Jamal, her voice cutting through the noise. "Carter, how long you been sitting on this? This is huge." He shrugged, wiping sweat from his brow, his chest tight with a mix of relief and dread. "Long enough," he said, his gaze flicking to the doors where Vivian had vanished. The crowd's cheers washed over him, a fleeting high, but his gut churned with a truth he couldn't shake. He'd toppled her, sure, but Vivian Blackwell wasn't the type to go quiet. She'd built an empire of corruption, roots deep in Birmingham's soil, and he'd just kicked the hornet's nest. This win wasn't the end. It was the spark, and the fire would come for him next. He flexed his fingers, still feeling the cold steel of the cuffs he'd locked on her, knowing 10 minutes of triumph wouldn't shield him from the storm she'd unleash. "What do you think about Jamal taking down a racist judge like that?" Drop a comment with number 1 if you're cheering him on, or number 2 if you think he's bitten off more than he can chew. Smash that like button if you're fired up for justice, and subscribe because tomorrow's episode will blow your mind with what's coming next. How far will Vivian's allies go to crush Jamal now that he's exposed her? Stick around to find out. Jamal Carter stepped out of the Birmingham courthouse into the late morning sun, the July heat slamming into him like a fist, his white shirt damp with sweat and wrinkled from the chaos inside. Hours had passed since he'd snapped handcuffs on Judge Vivian Blackwell, her shriek still ringing in his ears as the feds dragged her away. His phone buzzed non-stop, local news alerts screaming his name. Ex-cop turned PI busts corrupt judge. Strangers clapped him on the shoulder as he crossed the parking lot, a black woman in a nurse's scrubs shouting, "You did us proud," while a white guy in a baseball cap nodded, muttering, "About time." Jamal forced a tight smile, his sharp brown eyes scanning the crowd, but his chest felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap. He'd won, sure. Exposed Vivian's dirty deals with the Iron Vipers gang, but 20 years undercover taught him victories like this came with a price, and he could already feel it creeping closer. He climbed into his beat-up grey sedan, the leather seat scorching under his thighs, and drove home, the city blurring past in a haze of honking horns and shimmering asphalt. His apartment sat on the edge of Birmingham's west side, a third-floor walk-up in a brick building with chipped paint and a flickering stairwell light. He locked the door behind him, the deadbolt clicking loud in the quiet, and sank onto his couch, the springs groaning under his weight. The TV flickered on, a news anchor's voice filling the room. Vivian Blackwell, arrested in her own courtroom, faces bribery charges tied to the Iron Vipers. Hero of the hour? Jamal Carter, a former cop with a knack for justice. He muted it, rubbing his temples, the adrenaline draining out of him like water through a cracked cup. His phone lit up again, a text from Aisha Monroe, the reporter. "Stories live, you're a legend, watch your back." He smirked, typing back, always do. But the words felt hollow. He just started to peel off his shirt when a crash exploded through the room, glass shattering across the hardwood floor, a brick skidding to a stop near his feet. He ducked low, heart slamming against his ribs, his old cop instincts kicking in as he crawled to the window. Jagged shards framed a hole in the pane, the humid air rushing in, and he spotted a note taped to the brick, scrawled in black marker, "You're dead, boy." The slur hit like a slap, raw and personal, a promise of pain rooted in the hate Vivian wore like a badge. He scanned the street below, shadows shifting between parked cars, but no one stood out, just the hum of cicadas and distant traffic. His pulse raced, not from fear, but from the certainty that this was only the first shot. He grabbed his phone, dialing Malik Dyson, the warehouse worker who'd hired him to dig into the Carver site, where he'd been nabbed for trespassing. Malik's voice had been shaky when they last spoke, a man on edge, begging Jamal to keep his name out of it. The call went straight to voicemail, a robotic chime, then a message beeped through, Malik's whisper cutting the line. "They're coming for me, Carter. I'm sorry." The words hung there, cold and final, and Jamal's gut twisted. He redialed, nothing, then again, still nothing. Malik was gone, vanished like smoke, and Jamal knew who'd taken him. The Iron Vipers, Vivian's guard dogs, didn't mess around, and he'd just painted a bullseye on anyone tied to his case. He shoved the phone in his pocket, pacing the cramped living room, his boots crunching glass as his mind raced. He'd recorded Vivian's deal with the Vipers 2 weeks back, crouched in a rusted pickup across from their clubhouse, her voice clear as day on that grainy audio. They'd been paying her to bury arrests, drug busts, even a murder rap, and now they'd be out for blood, hers and his. He traced the threat back to them in a heartbeat, the brick a calling card, but he hadn't expected them to move this fast. A siren wailed outside, close, too close, and red-blue lights flashed through the broken window, bouncing off the walls. He froze, peering out as 3 cop cars screeched to a halt, doors flying open, 6 officers spilling onto the sidewalk, their hands on holsters. Birmingham PD, but not the good kind, not with Vivian's hooks in the force. He recognized one, Officer Tate, a beefy white guy with a buzz cut and a smirk, a regular at her chambers, always quick with a nightstick on the west side. They stormed the building, boots pounding up the stairs, and Jamal's stomach dropped. This wasn't a welfare check. The door rattled under a fist, Tate's voice barking through the wood. "Carter, open up, we got a tip you're holding." Jamal didn't move, his mind spinning. Drugs. He'd been clean his whole life, hadn't touched a drop since his undercover days. But that wouldn't matter. They'd plant what they needed, pin him like they'd pinned a dozen black men before him. The door splintered with a kick, crashing inward, and Tate led the charge, his flashlight blinding Jamal as he raised his hands. "On the floor now!" Tate roared, shoving him down, knee grinding into his spine. The other cops fanned out, flipping cushions, smashing lamps, tearing through drawers with a fury that screamed setup. A skinny officer with a patchy beard crowed, "Got it!" holding up a baggie of white powder pulled from under the sink, a grin splitting his face. Jamal's jaw tightened, his cheek pressed to the dusty hardwood, the lie so blatant it burned. "That ain't mine," he growled, but Tate just laughed, cuffing his wrists tight enough to bruise. "Tell it to the judge, thug." "Oh, wait, you already pissed her off." They trashed the place, tipping his desk, scattering the files he'd built on Vivian, papers fluttering like dead leaves. His laptop hit the floor, screen cracking, months of evidence shredded in minutes. Jamal's blood boiled, not at the cuffs, but at the precision of it, Vivian's fingerprints all over this hit even as she sat in a cell. They hauled him up, dragging him toward the door, but he twisted free, lunging for the back window. Tate lunged too, grabbing his shirt, but Jamal elbowed him hard, the crack of bone on bone echoing as he stumbled. He vaulted the sill, dropping, 10 feet to the alley below, landing rough on his knees, pain shooting up his legs. Sirens screamed behind him as he sprinted, ducking between rusted dumpsters, the night swallowing him whole. His heart pounded, breath ragged, the brick's threat flashing in his mind. "You're dead, boy." This wasn't random, wasn't coincidence. Vivian's allies were moving, the Vipers and her crooked cops, and Malik's voicemail played on loop in his head. "They're coming for me." He'd exposed her in court, turned her throne to ash, and now they'd burn him down in return. He slipped into the shadows, the humid air thick in his lungs, knowing his victory was a mirage, a fleeting high before the fall. The cops. Lights faded as he cut through a vacant lot, weeds snagging his jeans, his mind racing to the next move. He'd stashed backups of his evidence, a burner phone, a plan, but this hit harder than he'd braced for. Vivian's reach stretched beyond bars, her hate a living thing, and he'd just kicked off a war he might not survive. He pressed against a brick wall, catching his breath, the city's pulse a distant roar, and realized the target on his back wasn't just painted, it was carved. Jamal Carter crouched in the dim glow of a flickering neon sign outside a rundown motel on Birmingham's outskirts, the humid July night wrapping around him like a damp shroud. His knees ached from the alley drop, his white shirt torn at the elbow, streaked with dirt from dodging the cops who'd trashed his apartment hours ago. The brick's threat, "You're dead, boy," burned in his mind, but he shoved it down, his sharp brown eyes scanning the empty lot as he slipped a key into room 12's chipped door. Inside, the air stank of mildew and stale cigarettes, the single bulb casting jagged shadows across a sagging bed and a scratched table. He locked the door deadbolt and chain and sank into a wobbly chair, his breath steadying as he pulled a burner phone from his sock. His real phone was off, buried in his wrecked apartment, but he'd stashed backups, evidence, a lifeline. He powered it on, the screen's glow harsh against the gloom, and dialed Malik Dyson again, praying for an answer. Voicemail, that same panicked whisper. "They're coming for me, Carter. I'm sorry." His gut twisted, a cold knot forming, but he forced his hands steady, digging into a duffel he'd hidden under the bed weeks back. Inside, a USB drive, copies of Vivian Blackwell's Viper deals, photos, timestamps, enough to bury her twice. Over. He plugged it into a cheap laptop, the fan whirring as files loaded, his mind racing to piece it all together. The cops, the brick, Malik's silence. It was Vivian's machine grinding on, even with her in a cell. He'd exposed her in court that morning, flipped her world upside down, but she wasn't done, not by a long shot. A sharp buzz cut his thoughts, the TV flickering to life on its own, a loose wire sparking. A news anchor's voice blared, crisp and urgent. Breaking news in Birmingham. Jamal Carter, the man who arrested Judge Vivian Blackwell today, is now wanted for murder. His blood ran cold, the room tilting as the anchor continued. Malik Dyson, a local warehouse worker, was found dead near the Carver warehouse, stabbed with a knife linked to Carter. The screen flashed a grainy photo of him, his PI license mugshot, followed by Malik's face slack and pale, a crime scene shot with blood pooling on cracked concrete. Jamal's stomach lurched, his fists clenching as the anchor droned on. "Police! Say Carter's prints are on the weapon. A manhunt is underway." The feed cut to Vivian, out on bail already, standing outside the courthouse in a crisp grey suit, her silver hair gleaming under camera lights, a smirk curling her thin lips. "This violent thug thought he could slander me," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "But justice will prevail. He's a danger to us all." The broadcast ended, leaving Jamal staring at static, his pulse hammering in his ears. A setup, clean and brutal, her fingerprints all over it. He'd never owned a knife like that, never touched Malik beyond a handshake. But they'd pinned him, twisted his fight into a noose. His phone pinged, a text from Aisha Monroe. "Cops are lying, witness statements fake, stay low." He exhaled sharp and ragged, trusting her nose for truth but knowing it wouldn't stop the storm. Malik was dead, his client, his link to the warehouse, and they'd made Jamal the fall guy. He grabbed his keys, the duffel, and slipped out. The night swallowing him as he headed for the Carver warehouse, the only place he might find answers. The drive was quick, 10 minutes through dark streets, his sedan rattling over potholes until he parked a block away, cutting the lights. The warehouse loomed, a crumbling shell of brick and rusted steel, its windows black voids under a sliver of moon. He crept closer, boots silent on gravel, his sharp eyes catching the yellow crime scene tape flapping in the breeze. Blood stained the ground near a loading dock, Malik's blood, dark and sticky in the heat. He scanned for cameras, finding none, just like he'd noted weeks ago when he'd snapped those photos that landed him in court. His mind churned, piecing it together. Vipers took Malik, staged the kill, planted the knife all on Vivian's orders. She'd turned his evidence into a trap, flipped the script while he'd been catching his breath. A rustle snapped him back, a shadow shifting behind a stack of crates, and he ducked low, his hand brushing the pistol tucked in his waistband. Footsteps crunched, heavy and deliberate, and a figure emerged. A Viper thug, 6 feet of muscle in a leather vest, his bald head gleaming, a hunting knife flashing in his grip. "Carter," the thug growled, voice thick with menace. "Judge said you'd show up." Jamal bolted upright, dodging as the blade slashed air where his chest had been, the steel singing past him. He stumbled back, kicking gravel into the thug's face, buying a second to lunge behind a crate. His heart slammed, breath short the fighter blur of instinct from his undercover days. The thug charged again, knife arcing, and Jamal sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist, twisting hard until bone cracked. The blade clattered to the ground, and Jamal drove a fist into the thug's jaw, dropping him cold, his bulk hitting the dirt with a thud. Blood trickled from a cut on Jamal's arm, the sting sharp, but he didn't stop, kicking the knife into the shadows and sprinting for his car. He peeled out, tires screeching, the warehouse shrinking in his rear view as his mind raced. Vivian's. Reach was a web, cops and vipers her spiders, and they'd framed him for murder in hours. Malik's death wasn't random, it was a message, a blade aimed at his throat. He gripped the wheel, knuckles white, knowing the motel wasn't safe anymore, knowing Aisha's warning was all he had left. The news replayed in his head, Vivian's smirk a taunt, her words a promise. He's a danger. She'd turned. Birmingham against him, painted him as the black thug she'd always seen, and now he was running, bloodied, with a target he couldn't outpace. He'd dodged the thug, kept the evidence, but the noose was tightening, and Vivian's machine wasn't slowing down. What do you make of Vivian framing Jamal like that? Drop number 1 in the comments if you think she's pure evil, or number 2 if you reckon Jamal can still outsmart her. Hit that like button if this twist has you raging, and subscribe because tomorrow's drop is going to crank the heat even higher. Can Jamal claw his way out of this murder rap, or is Vivian's next move going to bury him deeper? Stay tuned to see. Jamal Carter hunched in the driver's seat of his battered sedan, parked under a sagging oak on a quiet Birmingham street, the humid night pressing in like a wet rag. His arm throbbed from the warehouse scuffle, a shallow cut crusted with blood. His white shirt now a tattered mess clinging to his sweat-soaked skin. The burner phone glowed in his hand, its dim light casting shadows across his sharp brown eyes as he replayed Malik Dyson's last voicemail, the words a ghost in his ear. They're coming for me. He'd escaped the Viper thug, kept the USB of Vivian Blackwell's dirty deals, but the murder frame-up twisted tighter around his neck. Birmingham PD wanted him for Malik's death, a knife with his prints a lie he couldn't shake, and Vivian's smirk on the news burned in his mind, her voice calling him a thug, now a citywide chant. He needed a lifeline, and Aisha Monroe was it. He texted her coordinates, a corner diner 3 miles out, and pulled onto the road, tires humming over cracked pavement, the city's pulse a distant throb. The diner sat low and grimy, its neon sign buzzing open in flickering red, the lot empty save for a rusted pickup. Jamal slipped inside, the bell jangling, and spotted Aisha in a back booth, her braids pulled tight, her notepad open, coffee steaming beside her. She looked up, her dark eyes sharp, and slid a tablet across the table as he sat. "You're a ghost out there," she said, voice low, "but I've got your back." He nodded, sliding the USB from his pocket, its plastic warm against his fingers. "This is everything. Vivian's Viper, payoffs, dates, amounts, get it out there." She plugged it in, files blooming on the screen, audio clips and grainy photos of Vivian meeting gang lieutenants in shadowed lots. Her jaw tightened as she scrolled, the weight of it sinking in. "This'll blow Birmingham wide open," she said, copying it fast, her fingers flying. "I'll post it tonight, raw, unfiltered." Jamal leaned back, the vinyl seat creaking, his chest loosening for the first time in hours. "Do it. Let 'em see her for what she is." Aisha uploaded it to her paper's site, a viral bomb titled Judge Blackwell's Gang Secrets, and within minutes, shares spiked, comments flooding in. By midnight, Birmingham erupted, phone alerts buzzing with news clips, protests flaring. Outside the courthouse, black teens waving signs reading "Justice for Jamal," white folks joining in chanting Vivian's name like a curse. Jamal's burner rang, a blocked number, and he answered, cautious. "Carter, it's Torres," came a gruff voice. "Agent Darnell Torres, the Fed from court. Saw the leak. We've got enough now. Blackwell's done, bail or not. We're moving. On her tomorrow." Jamal exhaled, a jagged breath, the words a lifeline. "You sure?" Torres chuckled, dry and hard. "Audio's legit. She's cooked. Lay low. You're clear soon." The call clicked off and Jamal slumped, the diner's hum fading as relief crept in. He dodged the frame, turned the tide, maybe even won. He thanked Aisha, her smile fierce, and slipped out, driving to a new hideout, a motel 10 miles north, its sign half-lit, the clerk too bored to ask questions. He locked himself in room 8, the bed sagging under stained sheets, and let his eyes close, the weight lifting, thinking he'd outrun Vivian's shadow. Then sirens screamed, close and sharp, ripping through the quiet just past 2 in the morning. Red-blue lights flashed through the thin curtains, and Jamal bolted upright, heart slamming, his pistol snatched from the duffel. The door exploded inward, wood splintering, and SWAT poured in, black gear gleaming, rifles raised. a dozen boots stomping the cheap carpet. "Down, Carter! Now!" a voice bellowed. A white officer with a buzz cut and a snarl, his shield glinting. Jamal dropped, hands up, the gun clattering as a knee drove into his back, pinning him to the floor. They swarmed, zip ties biting his wrists, fists raining down, a boot cracking his ribs, pain blooming hot and bright. He grunted, blood trickling from his lip, tasting copper as they yanked him up, his vision swimming. "Got a tip," the buzz cut growled, holding up a baggie of pills. "Drug stash right where we knew it'd be." Jamal's stomach sank, the lie so blatant it stung worse than the blows. "That's not mine," he rasped, but the officer smirked, tossing the baggie to a partner. "Sure, thug, tell it to lock up." They dragged him outside, the motel's gravel biting his knees, and Jamal caught the buzz cut's radio crackle. Witness saw him dealing judge's orders, Vivian's hand even from a cell twisting the knife deeper. The SWAT van loomed, its doors gaping, and they shoved him in, metal slamming shut, the air thick with diesel and sweat. His head spun, ribs screaming as the van lurched forward, Birmingham's lights blurring past. Aisha's leak had hit, protests raged, Torres had promised safety, but it was dust now, a mirage shredded by this raid. He replayed the day, cuffing Vivian, the cheers, the hope, and saw it for what it was. Bait. She'd played him. Let him. Taste victory, then snap the trap shut. The van jolted and he caught a glimpse of a news van outside, a reporter shouting, "Carter arrested again!" The driver laughed, a harsh bark. "Your little story's dead, man. Judge's friends say it's fake news." Jamal's fists clenched, the ties cutting deeper, his mind racing despite the pain. Aisha's post, the protests, they'd shaken. Vivian's world, but her allies hit back harder, planting drugs, spinning lies, turning his fight into a joke. He'd thought Torres's call meant freedom, thought the leak would shield him, but Vivian's reach slithered through bars, her hate of venom no Fed could cure. The van slowed, pulling into a precinct lot, floodlights glaring, and cops lined, up faces hard, a few smirking like Tate from the apartment raid. They hauled him out, shoving him toward booking, his boots dragging on concrete, blood smearing his chin. His ribs ached with every breath, but his sharp eyes burned, tracking every move, every face. He'd been here before, framed, cornered, 20 years ago in undercover busts gone wrong, but this was different, personal, a war Vivian waged with his name as the prize. The precinct doors loomed, steel and glass, and they pushed him through, the clang of bars ahead, a sound he knew too well. He'd handed Aisha the USB, thought he'd won, but Vivian's machine churned on, crushing his hope under boots and lies. The booking officer, a squat white man with a lazy eye, sneered as he snapped Jamal's photo, muttering, "Thought you were slick, huh?" Jamal said nothing, his jaw tight, the taste of blood a reminder of the fight still in him. They'd locked him up, sure, stripped his victory bare, but he wasn't broken, not yet. Vivian's smirk flashed in his mind, her voice on the news a taunt, and he knew this raid was just the start, a warning shot in a battle he'd barely begun to fight. Jamal Carter sat on a cold steel bench in a Birmingham jail cell, the air thick with sweat and rust, his ribs screaming from the SWAT beating hours ago. Blood crusted his split lip, his white shirt a shredded rag hanging off his lean frame. Every breath a jagged stab in his chest. The precinct buzzed beyond the bars, cops laughing, radios crackling, their voices a dull roar against the clang of metal doors. He'd been booked on the planted drug charge, a lie Vivian Blackwell's allies had spun to bury him, her smirk from the news still burning in his mind. The cell was cramped, 6 by 8, concrete walls scarred with graffiti, a flickering bulb overhead casting shadows that danced like ghosts. He flexed his bruised hands, the zip tie's marks red and raw, his sharp brown eyes scanning the space, instincts honed from 20 years undercover kicking in despite the pain. Footsteps echoed down the hall, heavy and uneven, and 3 figures loomed at the bars, Viper inmates, their leather vests swapped for orange jumpsuits, tattoos snaking up their necks. The tallest, a hulking white man with a shaved head and a jagged scar across his cheek, grinned, teeth yellowed and sharp. "Carter," he rasped. "Judge says hi." The guards lingered back, their smirks visible through the gloom, one muttering into a radio as the cell door slid open with a groan. Jamal stood, slow and deliberate, his body protesting but his mind locked in, ready. The scarred thug lunged first, a shiv flashing, a filed-down spoon aimed at his gut. Jamal twisted, the blade grazing his side. Hot pain blooming as he grabbed the man's arm, slamming it against the wall until the shiv clattered free. The second viper, wiry with a buzz cut, swung a fist, catching Jamal's jaw, stars bursting in his vision. He staggered, blood flooding his mouth, but drove his elbow into the man's throat, a wet choke cutting the air as he dropped. The third, stocky and silent, tackled him, pinning him to the floor, fists pounding his ribs. Each hit a hammer on cracked bone. Jamal roared, adrenaline surging, and rolled, flipping the thug off, his boot cracking the man's arm with a snap. The scarred leader charged again, but Jamal ducked, grabbing the shiv and slashing the man's thigh. Blood spraying as he crumpled, howling. Guards rushed in, batons swinging, pulling the vipers back, their laughter gone, replaced by curses. Jamal collapsed against the wall, blood pooling under him, his chest heaving, the cell spinning as pain swallowed him whole. "Stay down, thug," a guard spat, locking the door, but Jamal's eyes burned, defiance flickering through the haze. Hours later, a lawyer in a cheap suit got him out on a technicality, the drug charge shaky without a witness, and he stumbled. Into the dawn, ribs taped by a bored medic, his body a map of bruises. He hitched a ride to Aisha Munro's hideout, a cramped apartment above a laundromat, the hum of dryers masking his knock. She opened the door, her braids loose, eyes wide, at his state. "Jesus, Jamal," she whispered, pulling him in, the room cluttered with papers and a glowing laptop. He sank onto a couch, wincing, and she handed him water, her voice urgent. "I've got something, recorded yesterday." She played an audio, Vivian's voice crackling from jail. "DA needs 10 grand to kill Carter's case. Wire it now." A man's grunt followed. "Done, Judge." Jamal's blood ran cold, the proof a lifeline, Vivian's corruption still alive behind bars. "Torres needs this," he said, voice hoarse, and Aisha sent it to the Fed, her fingers trembling. By noon, news broke. Agent Torres raided Vivian's home, finding stacks of cash in a safe, her bail revoked, her arrest splashed across screens. Jamal's name trended again, protests swelling, Birmingham's streets alive with chants. He leaned back, the couch creaking, a flicker of hope igniting. "We got her," he rasped, thinking the tide had turned, the Viper's attack a last gasp. Then his phone rang, his sister Keisha's number, her voice a scream through static. "Jamal, they burned my house. Tiana's gone." His heart stopped, the room tilting, Aisha's gasp a distant echo. Keisha sobbed, "I was at work, came home to flames. Someone took her, Jamal." Tiana, his 8-year-old niece, bright eyes and gap-toothed smile, snatched in the ashes of his fight. He bolted up, pain forgotten, grabbing his keys, the audio's triumph dust in his throat. "Where are you?" he barked, and Keisha choked out, "Police station. They won't help." He hung up Aisha's hand on his arm, her voice shaking. "Vivian?" He nodded, jaw tight, the guard's taunt replaying. "Judge says hi." She'd hit back, not with fists, but with fire and blood, targeting his family, when he'd dared to breathe. He stormed out, the laundromat's heat a blur, driving to the station, his sedan rattling as rage fueled him. Keisha stood outside, her nurse's scrubs soot-streaked, tears cutting tracks down her face. "They said it's arson, but no leads," she cried, clutching him. "Tiana's all I got." He held her, his ribs screaming, mind racing. The house fire wasn't random, the kidnapping a blade to his heart, Vivian's revenge a living thing, stretching from her cell to burn his world. He'd fought off vipers, exposed her again, thought he'd won, but she'd played a card he couldn't counter, not yet. Cops milled nearby, their glances cold, some smirking, and he knew they'd look the other way, Vivian's allies still, thick in the ranks. He pulled Keisha close, whispering, "I'll find her," his voice steel despite the cracks, knowing this war had just gone deeper, darker, and he'd bleed more before it ended. What's your take on Vivian targeting Jamal's family like that? Comment number 1 if you think she's crossed a line no one can forgive, or number 2 if you believe Jamal's got the grit to save Tiana. smash that like button if this twist has you hooked, and subscribe because tomorrow's episode is going to hit harder than ever. Will Jamal rescue his niece, or has Vivian's revenge just begun to break him? Keep watching to find out. Jamal Carter stood outside the Birmingham police station, the late afternoon sun blazing down, his ribs a throbbing mess under his tattered white shirt as he held his sobbing sister, Keisha. Her house was ash, her 8-year-old daughter, Tiana, snatched by unseen hands, and the cop's cold shrugs screamed Vivian Blackwell's influence, her revenge cutting deeper than any blade. Keisha's soot-streaked scrubs trembled against him, her voice a broken plea. "Find her, Jamal. She's all I got." He nodded, jaw tight, his sharp brown eyes burning with a fury he hadn't felt since his undercover days. "I will," he said, voice steel, and peeled away, leaving her with a patrol car's hollow promises. He drove his rattling sedan to a Viper hangout he'd scoped months back, a squat bar on the city's east side, its windows blacked out, bikes lined up like teeth. The Iron Vipers, Vivian's muscle, had Tiana, he knew it, felt it in his bones, her taunt from jail a live wire in his mind. He parked a block away, dusk settling over Birmingham, the air thick with heat and menace. His pistol shook in his grip, a 9mm he'd stashed in the trunk, its weight a cold comfort as he slipped through an alley, boots crunching on broken glass. The bar's back door hung loose, music thumping inside, and he kicked it open, storming in, gun raised. 5 Vipers spun, beers crashing, their leather vests glinting under dim bulbs. "Where's my niece?" he roared, voice cracking the air, his finger twitching on the trigger. The biggest, a bearded thug with a skull tattoo, sneered, stepping forward. "You're dead, Carter." Jamal fired, the shot deafening, the bullet tearing through the man's knee, blood spraying as he crumpled, screaming. The others froze, hands hovering over knives, and Jamal advanced, sweat beading on his brow. "Tiana, now!" A wiry Viper with a ponytail spat. "Mill on 10th. Better hurry." Jamal bolted, leaving the thug writhing, the bar's chaos fading. As he hit the street, tires screeching toward the derelict mill. The building loomed, a skeleton of brick and steel, its windows shattered, shadows pooling inside. He crept in, gun up, the air stale with rust and rot, his ribs screaming with every step. A whimper cut the silence. Tiana's voice, small and scared, and he found her in a back room tied to a chair, her gap-toothed face streaked with tears. "Uncle Jamal," she cried, and he cut her ropes, pulling her close, her trembling body a lifeline against his chest. "I got you," he whispered, scooping her up, her 8-year-old frame light as air. He pulled his burner phone, hands shaking, and hit record, streaming live to Aisha Monroe's site. "This is Jamal Carter," he said, voice raw, camera on Tiana. "Vipers took my niece. Vivian Blackwell's behind it. Proof's coming." He posted it, the feed spiking. Birmingham's screens lighting up with his words. Protests surged outside the jail, chants of "Free Tiana" echoing, and news vans swarmed, the clip hitting thousands in minutes. By nightfall, Vivian's bail was revoked again, the public's rage a tidal wave, her arrest replayed on every channel. Jamal drove Tiana to Aisha's hideout, the laundromat apartment, her small hand clutching his as he handed her off. "Keep her safe," he told Aisha, her nod fierce, the room's hum a shield. He stepped outside, the humid air cool against his sweat, thinking he'd turned it, saved Tiana, broken Vivian's grip. Then a crack split the night, a sniper's bullet grazing his shoulder, fire searing his flesh as he dove behind his car. Glass shattered, the sedan's window exploding, and he rolled, blood soaking his sleeve, a note fluttering down. "Blackwell sends regards." He clutched his arm, pain blinding, his sharp eyes scanning the rooftops, spotting a shadow vanish. His heart slammed, the victory a lie, Vivian's reach a venomous claw even from lockup. He crawled to cover, a dumpster's rusted edge, breath ragged, the street silent save for crickets and distant sirens. Tiana was safe, the stream had hit. Vivian was back in cuffs, but this shot was her answer, a promise of death she'd never stop chasing. He'd stormed the Vipers, pulled Tiana from the mill, thought he'd won, but the bullet burned that hope to ash. His shoulder pulsed, blood dripping through his fingers, and he knew they'd tracked him, knew Aisha's place wasn't secure anymore. He staggered to his feet, the sedan a wreck, and limped into the shadows, his mind racing despite the haze. 20 years undercover, he'd faced worse odds, dodged bullets in darker corners. But this was different, a war Vivian waged, with his family as pawns. The note crinkled in his grip, her name a taunt, and he stuffed it in his pocket. The pain a fuel now, not a chain. He'd exposed her again, turned Birmingham against her, but she'd hit back harder, a sniper's precision trumping his live stream's roar. He slipped into an alley, the city's pulse a distant hum, his boots dragging as he plotted his next move. Tiana's face flashed, her smile a light he'd fought for, and he clung to it, knowing Vivian's next strike would aim to snuff it out. The shoulder wound throbbed, a reminder of how close he'd come, how far he'd fall if he stopped. He'd saved his niece, sure, turned the public's rage into a weapon, but Vivian's machine churned on, her hate a fire that burned beyond bars. He pressed against a brick wall, catching his breath, the night swallowing him as he realized this wasn't a win, it was a gauntlet, and he'd bleed more before it ended. Jamal Carter crouched in a Birmingham alley, the humid night thick around him, his shoulder pulsing with pain from the sniper's bullet that had grazed him hours ago. Blood soaked his torn white shirt, dripping down his arm, but he pressed a rag to the wound, his sharp brown eyes darting through the shadows as he caught his breath. Tiana was safe with Aisha Monroe, his live stream of her rescue still burning up screens across the city, but Vivian Blackwell's note, "Blackwell sends regards," crinkled in his pocket, a venomous reminder she wasn't done. He'd saved. His niece turned Birmingham's rage against her, but that shot meant war, and he wasn't waiting for her next move. His burner phone buzzed, Agent Darnell Torres's voice cutting through. "Carter, meet me at the old rail yard, midnight. Got a tip on a Viper deal." Jamal grunted, "On it," and limped to his sedan, the shattered window a jagged frame as he drove, the city's lights blurring past. The rail yard sprawled dark and rusted, train cars looming like ghosts under a sliver of moon. Torres waited, by a busted fence, his buzz cut glinting, his navy jacket tight over broad shoulders. "Big shipment," he whispered, nodding at a cluster of Vipers unloading crates from a truck, their voices low, guns glinting. "Drugs and cash, tied to Blackwell." Jamal's jaw tightened, the pain a dull roar as he gripped his pistol. "Let's end this." They moved silent, shadows among shadows, until Torres signaled, and Jamal kicked over a barrel, the crash splitting the night. Vipers spun, shouting, and Jamal fired, a bullet ripping through a crate, white powder exploding as Torres tackled. A thug, cuffs snapping. Jamal ducked a wild swing, slamming his gun's butt into a Viper's skull, the man dropping like stone. 5 minutes of chaos, and they had 6 Vipers down, crates seized, ledgers spilling from a duffel, pages stamped with Vivian's initials, millions in bribes laid bare. Torres grinned, clapping Jamal's good shoulder. "This'll gut her network." By dawn, the feds moved, raids hitting Birmingham like thunder, live on every channel. Cops, lawyers, councilmen, Vivian's allies hauled out in cuffs, their homes torn open, cash and guns piled high. News anchors stammered, "Blackwell's empire collapses," showing Torres with the ledgers. Jamal's name cleared in bold. Text. Protests swelled, signs reading "Carter's right," the city's pulse a roar of reckoning. Jamal drove to Aisha's hideout, the laundromat humming below, Tiana's giggle drifting as he climbed the stairs. She ran to him, her gap-toothed smile a balm, and he hugged her tight, his ribs groaning but his chest light. "You're safe, baby girl," he said, Keisha's voice on the phone, a tearful thanks. Aisha watched, her braids swaying, her laptop glowing with the raid footage. "You did it, Jamal," she said, her smile fierce. "She's finished." He nodded, sinking onto the couch, thinking it was over. The Vipers broken, Vivian's web snapped. Then a boom shook the building, a fireball erupting from Aisha's desk, glass shattering, flames licking the walls. Jamal grabbed Tiana, diving. Behind the couch as the blast threw him back, heat searing his face, his ears ringing. Debris rained, the room a haze of smoke and ruin, and he crawled, Tiana clinging to him, her screams piercing the chaos. "Aisha!" he yelled, voice raw, and found her near the door. Her body crumpled, blood pooling under her braids, her hand clutching the USB, its plastic melted. His stomach lurched, bile rising as he checked her pulse. Nothing, her sharp eyes dull, gone. Tiana sobbed. "Uncle Jamal, she's hurt." And he pulled her close, shielding her from the sight, his own eyes stinging with ash and grief. Sirens wailed, close now, and his burner rang, a viper's voice snarling through, "Judge says you'll never win." The call cut, and Jamal's blood ran cold, the bomb Vivian's claw, her hate a bomb even from a cell. Firefighters stormed in, shouting, dragging them out, the laundromat a pyre below, tenants fleeing in the street. Jamal stood, Tiana trembling in his arms, his shoulder bleeding again, the USB a charred relic in his fist. News vans swarmed, cameras rolling, a reporter yelling, "Carter's ally killed in explosion." The raid footage looped on screens, Vivian's collapse of victory now ashes in his mouth. He'd ambushed the Vipers, handed Torres the ledgers, cleared his name, thought he'd won, but this was her answer. A blast that took Aisha, the woman who'd fought beside him, her voice silenced in fire. His sharp eyes burned, tracking the crowd. The cops, knowing Vivian's allies, lingered, their hands on this trigger. He'd broken her system, sure, sent her cronies to jail, but she'd hit back harder, a bomb trumping his evidence, racial hate fueling her reach. Tiana's tears soaked his shirt, and he held her tighter, guilt clawing his gut, knowing his fight had cost this price. Paramedics rushed up, checking his shoulder, but he waved them off, his mind racing despite the haze. 20 years undercover. He'd lost partners, seen blood, but this cut deeper. Aisha's death a wound he couldn't stitch. The Viper's taunt replayed, "You'll never win." And he knew it wasn't bluff, Vivian's machine churning on, her revenge a wildfire he couldn't outrun. He limped to Keisha's car, pulling up, handing Tiana over, her small hands clinging as he whispered, "I'll fix this." The street pulsed with chaos, firelight dancing on his face, and he realized this wasn't the end. It was a pivot, a war Vivian waged with his soul as the prize. What do you think of Vivian bombing Aisha to hit Jamal? Comment number 1. If you're gutted she's gone, or number 2 if you think Jamal's fight's worth the cost. Hit that like button if this blast has you reeling, and subscribe because tomorrow's chapter is gonna push the edge even further. Can Jamal strike back after losing his ally, or will Vivian's next blow finish him? Stay locked in to see. Jamal Carter stood in the Birmingham street, the night air thick with smoke and grief, his sharp brown eyes fixed on the burning husk of Aisha Monroe's hideout, flames licking the laundromat below. Tiana clung to Keisha in her car nearby, safe, but trembling, while Aisha's bloodied hand haunted him, the melted USB a charred weight in his pocket. The Viper's taunt, "Judge says you'll never win," echoed in his skull. Vivian Blackwell's hate a fire that had taken his ally, turned his victory to ash. His shoulder throbbed, the sniper's graze a dull ache under his shredded white shirt. But rage burned hotter, a fuel he hadn't tapped since his undercover days. He slipped away as sirens wailed, firefighters shouting, his sedans shattered, window a jagged frame as he drove to the derelict mill on 10th, where he'd rescued Tiana days ago. The brick shell loomed, dark and silent, a Viper stash he'd clocked during his PI runs. He parked a block out, the humid air clinging to his skin, and popped the trunk, pulling gas canisters he'd stashed after a bust gone wrong years back. His ribs groaned, his body a map of bruises, but he moved fast, rigging the mill's backroom, splashing fuel over crates and walls, the stench sharp in his nose. He set a tripwire, a crude spark from a lighter and wire, and waited in the shadows, his pistol steady, breath slow. Headlights cut the night. 3 Viper bikes rolling in, their engines agrowl as 6 thugs dismounted, leather vests glinting, voices loud with curses about Carter's mess. He lured them, kicking a rock to clatter inside, and they stormed. The mill, boots thudding, guns drawn. The wire snapped, a whoosh igniting the air, and flames erupted, swallowing the room in a roar. Screams pierced the blaze, vipers thrashing as fire ate their flesh, the mill a pyre lighting the sky. Jamal watched, his face hard, the heat searing his skin, Aisha's death a ghost driving his hand. 2 escaped, burning, collapsing outside. And he shot once, twice, mercy or vengeance, he didn't care, their bodies still in the dirt. Birmingham reeled by morning, news vans swarming the smouldering ruin, anchors stammering, vigilante or hero. Carter linked to viper deaths. Social. Media split, some cheering. He's cleaning the streets, others raging, he's a thug gone rogue. Protests swelled, signs waving justice for Aisha. Public pressure crashing like a wave. And Agent Darnell Torres had no choice, arresting Jamal at dawn outside Keisha's temporary motel. "You're a damn fool," Torres growled, cuffing him, but his eyes flickered with grudging respect. The precinct buzzed, cops glaring, some spitting slurs as they booked him, arson and murder pinned on his name. His mugshot flashed online, his lean face bruised, eyes defiant, and Birmingham's streets erupted louder, marches blocking roads, chants drowning sirens. By noon, the DA buckled, charges dropped under the glare of thousands, and Torres cut him loose, muttering, "They're calling you untouchable." Jamal limped out, the sun harsh on his cuts, Keisha's hug a lifeline, Tiana's small hand in his tether. He exhaled, thinking the viper's screams had bought him space, turned Vivian's game back on her, her allies rattled. Then a blast, rocked the precinct lot, a car bomb detonating 50 feet away, shrapnel slicing the air, a jagged shard cutting his leg as he dove, shielding Tiana. Smoke billowed, screams splitting the crowd, his ears ringing, blood pooling under his knee. Cops scattered, radios crackling, and Jamal crawled, dragging Tiana to cover, her cries sharp in his chest. A wallet skidded from the wreckage, a hitman's ID, a white guy named Ray Coulter, his photo cold-eyed, linked to Vivian's cousin, State Senator Paul Hensley. Jamal's stomach sank, the web deeper than he'd dreamed, Vivian's reach a hydra sprouting new heads. His leg burned, the cut deep, shrapnel glinting in flesh. But he stood, Tiana clinging, Keisha's gasp a distant echo. News vans swarmed, cameras rolling. Carter survives assassination attempt, flashing across screens. The mill fire looped beside it, his name a lightning rod, Birmingham split between savior and scourge. He'd torched the vipers, walked free. Thought he'd struck a blow, but this bomb was Vivian's reply, her hate a precision strike from a supermax cell. He limped to Keisha's car, blood soaking his jeans, the hitman's ID clutched tight. Senator Hensley's name a new shadow. 20 years undercover, he'd burned stash houses, taken hits. But this was a war on his blood, his soul, Vivian's machine churning through bars and bombs. The precinct lot pulsed with chaos, medics, rushing, and he waved them off, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. Knowing her allies lurked, their hands on this trigger. He'd avenged Aisha, sure, turned Birmingham's rage into a shield, but the car bomb flipped it, a near-lethal swipe that missed by inches. Tiana's tears wet his neck, and he held her closer, guilt clawing his gut, the cost of his fight piling. Higher. The senator's link loomed, a thread he hadn't pulled, Vivian's family a fortress he'd barely scratched. He drove off, Keisha silent, the city's hum a dull roar, his leg throbbing as he plotted his next strike. The viper's scream still rang, a hollow win, and he knew Vivian's next move would aim to finish him, her hate a fire he couldn't outrun. He pressed the gas, the sedan rattling, realizing this wasn't a victory, it was a gauntlet, and he'd bleed more before it broke. Jamal Carter sat in Keisha's borrowed sedan, parked under a flickering street lamp in a quiet Birmingham suburb, the humid night pressing in like a fever. His leg throbbed. The shrapnel wound from the car bomb, bandaged but raw, blood seeping. Through his jeans, his white shirt a tattered relic, hanging off his bruised frame, Tiana slept in the back, her small chest rising and falling, safe for now, but the hitman's ID burned in his pocket. Ray Coulter's photo tied to Senator Paul Hensley, Vivian Blackwell's cousin. The bomb had missed by inches. A viper's. Strike from her supermax cell, and Jamal knew the web stretched deeper. a family fortress he had to crack. He kissed Tiana's forehead, whispering to Keisha, "Keep her close," and slipped out, the sedan's door clicking shut as he limped toward Hensley's mansion, 3 miles out, a sprawling estate glowing against the dark. His sharp brown eyes tracked the shadows, 20 years undercover guiding his steps. The pain a dull roar he pushed down. The mansion loomed, white columns and manicured lawns, a guard pacing the gate, his flashlight cutting the night. Jamal circled wide, scaling a back fence, barbed wire snagging his sleeve, his ribs groaning as he dropped into a rose garden, thorns biting his hands. He crept to a side window, glass cool under his fingers, and jimmied it open with a knife. Sliding into a study, the air thick with leather and cigar smoke, bookshelves towered, a desk gleamed, and a safe sat squat in the corner, steel and silent. He knelt, his leg pulsing, and pulled a stethoscope from his pack, an old trick from busting dealers' stashes. The tumblers clicked under his ear, sweat beading on his brow, and the door swung open, revealing a stack of tapes, labeled in Sharpie. VB calls. His heart slammed. Vivian's voice, a ghost he'd chased to the end. He plugged a tape into data player from the desk, her hiss crackling through. "Carter's still breathing. Frame him for Hensley's kid. Make it stick." A man's grunt followed. "I'll handle it, Viv. Another 50 grand? She snapped. "Yes, but bury him. Permanent this time." Jamal's blood ran cold. Recordings of her plotting from jail, murders, bribes. A plan to pin him with a senator's child's death. A lie so vile it shook him. He copied the tapes to a USB, hands trembling, and slipped out, the mansions. Silence await as he scaled the fence again, thorns tearing fresh cuts. By dawn he met Agent Darnell Torres at a gas station, the Fed's jaw tight as Jamal handed over the drive. "Nationwide," Jamal said, voice hoarse. "Let 'em hear." "Her," Torres nodded, and hours later the leak hit, every news outlet blaring Vivian's voice. "Bury him permanent." The tapes a bombshell shredding her last threads. Senator Hensley's arrest flashed next, cuffs on his wrists outside the mansion. His face pale, Birmingham's screens alive with Blackwell's family falls. Protests roared louder, streets clogged, the city chanting Jamal's name, his mugshot replaced with hero shots, his name cleared in bold ink. He walked free by noon, limping from a precinct, the sun harsh on his cuts, Keisha and Tiana waiting. In the lot, their hugs a lifeline. "You did it, Uncle Jamal," Tiana beamed, her gap-toothed smile alight, and he ruffled her hair, thinking Vivian's empire was dust, her Supermax cage, a tomb. Then his phone rang, Tiana's school principal's voice trembling. "She's gone, Mr. Carter. Masked men took her from recess." His stomach dropped, the lot spinning, Keisha's gasp a knife as he barked, "When?" The principal stammered, 20 minutes ago, police are here." He hung up, racing to the school, his sedan rattling, blood pounding in his ears. The playground swarmed with cops, kids crying, teachers pale, and a grainy security feed showed 3 masked figures dragging Tiana away, her small fists swinging. His phone buzzed, a video streaming live, Vivian's voice a snarl through static. "You'll bury her like you buried me, Carter." The screen cut to Tiana, bound in a dark room, her eyes wide, a gag muffling her screams. Jamal's knees buckled, Keisha sobbing beside him, the triumph of hours ago a lie, Vivian's last card, a child's life. He clutched the phone, his sharp, eyes burning, the cops' shrugs a taunt, their hands tied or bought, he couldn't tell. "I'll find her," he growled, voice steel, but his chest cracked, guilt clawing his gut. The tapes a hollow win now. He'd stormed Hensley's safe, exposed Vivian nationwide, thought he'd ended her, but she'd hit back harder, a kidnapping, trumping his evidence, racial hate a blade to his heart. The school's chaos pulsed, parents shouting, and he pushed through, mind racing despite the haze. 20 years undercover, he'd tracked kids through worse hells, but this was his blood, his fight. Vivian's revenge a mirror of every slur she'd spat. He drove off, Keisha's pleas fading. The city's hum a dull roar, his leg bleeding through the bandage as he hunted the shadows. The video looped in his head, Tiana's muffled cries a spur, and he knew Vivian's allies lingered, their masks. Her orders. He'd cleared his name, sure, turned Birmingham's rage into a spear, but this snatch flipped it, a blow he couldn't dodge. His sharp eyes scanned the road, every turn a guess, realizing this wasn't the end. It was a pivot. A war Vivian waged with his family as the prize. Jamal Carter tore through Birmingham's outskirts in his battered sedan, the humid night a suffocating blanket. His sharp brown eyes locked on the road as Tiana's muffled cries from Vivian Blackwell's video looped in his skull. His leg bled. Through the shrapnel-torn jeans, his white shirt a shredded ruin clinging to his bruised frame, every breath a stab in his cracked ribs. The school's security feed had shown masked men snatching his 8-year-old niece. Vivian's voice a snarl. "You'll bury her like you buried me." He'd exposed her jail plots nationwide hours ago, toppled Senator Hensley, thought he'd won, but this was her endgame, a racial blade to his heart. Keisha's sobs echoed in his ear from their last call. "Bring her back, Jamal," and he gripped the wheel, knuckles white, pushing the car past its limits. A tip from a shaky viper snitch, bought with a fist and a promise, pointed him to a swamp 20 miles south, a bog of cypress and murk where they'd stashed Tiana. He ditched. The sedan at the edge, mud sucking at his boots as he plunged in, pistol drawn. The air thick with rotten mosquitoes. His sharp eyes tracked bent reeds, a snapped branch, signs of a crew moving fast, and he followed. The swamp's chorus of frogs a dull hum against his pounding pulse. Moonlight filtered through twisted trees, glinting off water, and a flicker caught his gaze, a shack on stilts, its wood weathered, a lantern swinging inside. Gunfire cracked the silence, a bullet splintering bark inches from his head, and he dove, rolling into muck, his legs screaming as he fired back, the muzzle flash a beacon. 3 masked figures loomed, vipers, their rifles spitting lead, and Jamal scrambled, mud coating his cuts, returning shots, one catching a thug's shoulder, blood spraying as he fell. "Tiana!" he roared, voice raw and her whimper cut through, faint but alive, spurring him on. He flanked wide, reeds slicing his hands, and spotted her, tied to a cypress, her gap-toothed face streaked with tears, ropes biting her wrists. A viper charged, knife flashing, and Jamal lunged, tackling him into the water, the blade slashing air as he drove his fist into the man's throat, a gurgle fading under the splash. The third fired, a round tearing through Jamal's chest, hot, agony blooming, blood soaking his shirt as he staggered, vision blurring. He fired blind, the shot true, the thug dropping with a hole in his skull, and Jamal stumbled to Tiana, cutting her free with trembling hands, her small arms wrapping his neck. "Uncle Jamal," she sobbed, and he held her, mud and blood mixing. His breath a ragged wheeze. Choppers roared overhead, blades slicing the night, and floodlights bathed the swamp, Agent Darnell Torres's voice booming from a megaphone. "Feds! Drop your weapons!" Jamal had texted him the snitch's tip. Mid-drive, a desperate Hail Mary, and now agents swarmed, boots splashing, cuffing the last viper writhing in the muck. Torres ran up, his buzz cut glinting, eyes wide at Jamal's state. "You're a mess, Carter," he said, waving medics, but Jamal waved them off, clutching Tiana, his chest a furnace of pain. "Vivian," he rasped, handing Torres the phone. The video still loaded. "Trace it." The feds tracked it fast, her voice tied to a smuggled cell in Supermax, and news broke by morning. Vivian stripped of all contact, buried in solitary, her empire ash, her crew caught. Birmingham's screens lit up, Blackwell broken, the swamp raid a viral clip, Jamal's name a chant again. Medics pried Tiana from him, her cries fading as they loaded him into an ambulance, his chest a bloody ruin, the world fading to black. "Stay with us, Carter," a medic shouted, paddles jolting his heart, flatlines beeping as they fought to pull him back. He woke hours later, hospital lights harsh, Tiana's face hovering, Keisha's hand on his, tubes snaking from his arm. "You're okay," she whispered, tears shining, and he nodded, voice gone, the pain a dull roar now. Vivian's final defeat flashed on the TV, her solitary cell a tomb. The Viper's swamp hideout a graveyard, her voice silenced at last. He'd tracked her to the bog, fought through gunfire, saved Tiana, but the cost carved scars deep, his chest stitched, his breath shallow. 20 years undercover, he'd danced with death, but this was closer. A war Vivian waged with his blood as the price. The hospital room hummed, machines beeping, and he squeezed Tiana's hand, her gap-toothed smile alight, knowing he'd broken the beast, ended her reign. The feds had stormed in, sure, locked her away, but he'd bled for it, nearly died for it, the swamp's muck still under his nails. Birmingham pulsed outside, protests quieting, and he lay there, alive but cracked, realizing this win was Pyrrhic, a triumph bought with too much loss. Jamal Carter lay in a sterile Birmingham hospital room, the antiseptic sting sharp in his nose, his chest a patchwork of stitches under a thin gown, each breath a shallow pull against the bullet wound that had nearly claimed him in the swamp. The machines beeped a steady rhythm, their green lines jagged but alive, a lifeline he'd clawed back from the edge of death. Tiana sat curled in a chair beside him, her 8-year-old frame dwarfed by the vinyl, her gap-toothed smile flickering. As she clutched his hand, her small fingers warm against his bruised skin. Keisha hovered near the window, her nurse's scrubs traded for a hoodie, her eyes red-rimmed but steady, watching him like he might slip away again. The TV flickered on the wall, muted, its screen looping footage of the swamp raid. Federal choppers. Cutting the night, Vivian Blackwell's final defeat a headline in bold, Judge buried in solitary Empire dust. Months had passed since that bloody night, since he'd tracked Tiana through the muck, fought vipers with gunfire and grit, and flatlined in the ambulance, medics shouting as they shocked him back. His body bore the scars, a map of cuts and bruises, his legs still stiff from the car bomb's shrapnel, his white shirt long gone, replaced by bandages and time. He'd woken days later, tubes snaking from his arm, Tiana's face the first light through the haze, and now, 3 months. He was whole enough to move, to breathe, to plan. The hospital discharged him that October morning, the air crisp outside. Leaves skittering across the lot as he limped to Keisha's car, his cane tapping the asphalt, Tiana skipping ahead, her laughter a balm. Birmingham had shifted in his absence, the protests quieting. Vivian's name a curse whispered in corners, her supermax cell a concrete tomb stripped of contact, her voice silenced at last. Agent Darnell Torres had called weeks back, his gruff tone laced with awe. "She's done, Carter. No calls, no letters, nothing. You broke her." Jamal had nodded into the phone, his chest tight, knowing he'd ended her reign. But the cost lingered. Aisha's death a weight he couldn't shake, her bloodied hand a ghost in his dreams. He spent weeks rebuilding, his apartment trashed beyond repair, Keisha's new rental, a temporary home where he slept on a couch, Tiana's drawings taped to the walls, stick figures of Uncle Jamal, with a cape. His sharp brown eyes traced the city's pulse, news clips praising him. Carter Clear's name topples corruption, but he saw the cracks, the wrongful convictions still rotting in cells, black men like him caged by Vivian's kind. The idea hit him late one night, rain drumming the roof, Tiana asleep on his chest, her breath soft. A fund, a fight for the voiceless, a legacy from the ashes. He called Torres, his voice hoarse but firm. "I want to start something." Birmingham. Justice Fund. Use donations. Help the wrongfully convicted. No salary, just justice. Torres paused, then laughed, dry and hard. "You're crazy, Carter, but it's good. I'll pitch it to the feds." Days later, approval came, seed money from seized Viper cash, and Jamal moved, renting a small office downtown, an old brick storefront near the precinct, its windows dusty but wide. He painted it himself, his legs stiff, Tiana wielding a roller, giggling as paint flecked her braids, Keisha hauling desks from a thrift shop. The sign went up, Birmingham Justice Fund, bold black letters on white, and the opening day dawned, November 3rd, the air cool, the street alive with faces. Jamal stood at the door, his cane traded for a limp, his grey suit crisp despite, the scars beneath, Tiana at his side in a blue dress, her hand in his. Over 100 gathered fans, locals, former colleagues, their applause a thunder as he cut the ribbon, red fabric fluttering to the ground. "This ain't about me," he said, voice steady, carrying over the crowd. "It's about the forgotten, the ones Vivian and her kind locked away, We're gonna fight for 'em, get 'em lawyers, get 'em justice." The crowd nodded, a mother shouting, "You're a hero, Carter!" Her phone raised, snapping photos. Donations poured in, cash stuffed in a jar, checks from strangers, a tweet from a basketball star flashing on screens. 10 grand to Carter's fund, man's a legend. By dusk, $50,000 stacked up, Birmingham's heart beating through every bill. And Jamal smiled, faint but real, Tiana tugging his sleeve, whispering, "You're like a superhero." He ruffled her hair, the weight lifting, thinking, this was it. The end of the war, Vivian powerless, his fight turned to hope. The office hummed that week, volunteers filing cases, attorneys poring over records, the first client a wiry black man, Tyrone Banks, 42, 5 years, lost to a bogus drug rap. Jamal shook his hand, promising, "We start today," and the work began, a rhythm of redemption he'd bled for. Vivian rotted in solitary, the news said. Her Supermax cell a 6x8 box. No light, no sound, her silver hair matted, her thin frame hunched, stripped of the power she'd wielded like a gavel. Reports trickled out, guards whispering she'd scream at walls, "Carter'll pay." Her voice a rasp lost in concrete, her empire ash, her allies caged or fled. Jamal saw it on TV, her mugshot a hollow shell, and felt nothing, no triumph, just a void where her hate had burned. He'd ended her, sure, buried her in that tomb. But the scars stayed, Aisha's death, Tiana's tears, his own blood a price he'd paid. The fund grew, another 100,000 by December, cases piling, Birmingham's faith a tide lifting him up. He limped through the office daily, his cane back some days, Tiana colouring at a desk, Keisha dropping coffee, the routine a shield against the past. Then a letter slipped through, no stamp, no return, slid under the door one icy morning, its scrawl jagged, "You framed her, Carter. Tapes were fake, Vipers'll burn this city for her." His stomach dropped, the words a punch, doubt flickering like a match in the dark. A Viper survivor, some ghost from the mill fire claiming he'd bent the truth, forged Vivian's voice to win. He stared at the page, his sharp eyes tracing every loop, the accusation a worm in his gut. He'd recorded her himself, crouched in that pickup outside the Viper clubhouse, her hiss clear. 20,000 by Friday. The tapes from Hensley's, "Save her jail plots, bury him permanent," he'd heard them, handed them to Torres, watched them break her. But the letter gnawed, a whisper of maybe, a crack in his certainty. Had he pushed too far, twisted evidence in the heat, crossed a line he'd sworn to hold? He shoved it in a drawer, locked it, but the doubt lingered, a shadow on his scars. The fund's first case hit a wall days later, Tyrone Banks's appeal crumbling, a judge tossing it, citing tainted process, whispers of Carter's vigilante past poisoning the air. Jamal sat in the office, dusk painting the walls gold, Tiana asleep on a couch, Keisha gone home, the silence heavy. He pulled the letter out, reread it, the words sharper now. Tapes were fake. And his chest tightened, the triumph of months. A fragile thing. Birmingham cheered him still, donations flowing, but the case's collapse stung, a ripple he couldn't stop. Had he framed her, bent justice to match her hate, become the thug she'd called him that first day? He'd stood in court, cuffed her, flipped her world. But this twist turned it inward, a mirror he couldn't unsee. He limped outside, the cold biting his leg, the city's skyline a jagged line against the horizon, and stared, breath fogging. The air. The fund stood 100 grand strong, a fight for the voiceless, but the letter's claim echoed a Viper's vow to burn it all. He'd saved Tiana, ended Vivian, built this legacy, but the cost piled high, Aisha's blood, his own, and now this doubt, a crack in the foundation. 20 years undercover, he'd played dirty to survive, but this was different, a war he'd won, maybe too well. The office light glowed behind him, Tiana's drawings a splash of color, and he leaned on the wall, cane tapping, realizing his justice might have birthed a lie, a beast he'd caged in Vivian's cell. The city hummed, oblivious, and he stood, there scarred and limping, knowing this wasn't the end but a pivot, a shadow he'd face alone, his legacy teetering on a truth he might never prove. Jamal Carter's journey through a storm of racial injustice offers profound lessons that cut to the heart of resilience, justice, and the cost of fighting systemic corruption. First, his story teaches us the power of unwavering determination. Facing a racist judge, Vivian Blackwell, who dismissed him as a thug, Jamal didn't crumble. He turned her insult into a weapon, exposing her corruption with evidence he'd painstakingly gathered. This grit, forged through 20 years as an undercover cop, shows that standing tall against prejudice, even when the odds stack high, can topple giants. Yet it's a double-edged sword. His persistence saved lives but scarred his own, a reminder that courage carries a heavy toll. Second, the tale underscores the insidious reach of systemic racism. Vivian's web wasn't just personal hate, it was a machine of cops, vipers, and senators, all fueled by racial bias to crush Jamal at every turn. From false arrests to bombings, each blow magnified the last, proving that injustice isn't a single act but a hydra, regrowing heads when one falls. Jamal's fight to save Tiana and launch the Birmingham Justice Fund highlights the need to dismantle these roots, not just prune the branches, a lesson in battling the system, not just its faces. Third, sacrifice emerges as a brutal truth. Aisha's death, Tiana's kidnappings, Jamal's near-fatal wounds. These weren't footnotes but the price of his war. He won, burying Vivian in solitary, but lost pieces of himself, showing that justice often demands more than we can bear. This isn't a fairy tale of clean victories. There's a gritty mirror to real struggles where every gain bleeds. Finally, the stunning twist, the Viper's letter claiming Jamal framed Vivian, forces a reckoning with moral ambiguity. Did he bend the truth to win, crossing into the grey he'd fought against? It's a haunting question, teaching that even the righteous can falter, that justice might blur into vengeance under pressure. His legacy, the fund, teeters on this doubt, a lesson that our actions ripple beyond intent, shaping futures we can't fully control. Jamal's story isn't just a thrill ride, it's a call to reflect. It asks us to value resilience but weigh its costs, to attack systemic wrongs but guard our souls, to seek justice but question our means. What do you think? Did Jamal's ends justify his methods, or did he lose more than he gained? Drop number 1 in the comments if you believe his fight was worth it, or number 2 if you think the cost was too steep. Hit that like button if this tale stirred you, subscribe for more hard-hitting stories, and share to spark the conversation. Thanks for walking this road with us. Here's to finding strength in the shadows and justice in the struggle.